My name is Rosie Hale. I'm 34 years old, a certified nursing assistant in Asheville, North Carolina, and my grandmother June's primary caregiver for the past 14 months. Every morning at 6:40, I crushed her blood pressure pills at the kitchen counter, logged her sleep, and drove her to every appointment. Without a contract, without a paycheck, without a single family member who thought to ask if I was okay. Then my father Daniel called a family meeting. He laid a printed Hawaii itinerary on the coffee table, like it was already decided. Then he smiled. "You're not coming, Rosie. Somebody has to stay and babysit Grandma." My brother checked his phone. My sister touched her bracelet. Nobody looked at me. I bent down to fix the blanket slipping from June's knees. Her fingers caught my wrist, thin and papery, but the grip was hard. She pulled me close and whispered, "Write down everything now." 4 days later, I found a receipt inside Daniel's desk. $12,500. Sunrise Pines Memory Care. Dated the same afternoon he told me I was family. The intake forms described June as nonverbal, aggressive, late-stage dementia. June, who read the newspaper every morning and beat me at crossword puzzles on Tuesdays. The bank records listed $18,000 as caregiver reimbursement. For me, I had never been paid a single dollar. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. I'm a caregiver. I know exactly what real cognitive decline looks like. I also know what it looks like when a family starts building a story around an old woman before they try to put her away. He needed a witness in the house who didn't know she was one. He miscalculated. The first thing Rosie Hale did every morning was listen. Not consciously, not with any practiced intention, but the way a person listens. When their body has been trained by years of routine to register sound before full wakefulness. The creak of the third stair. The particular hiss of the old radiator in the upstairs hall. The steady, unhurried rhythm of June's breathing drifting through a door that was never entirely closed. If anything had shifted in the night, if a glass had tipped, if footsteps had wandered, if breathing had gone shallow or labored, Rosie would have known before she opened her eyes. At 6:40 on a gray November morning, she stood at June's kitchen counter with the damp smell of Asheville fog pressed against every window. The coffee maker rattled and sputtered beside a faded Medicare statement that had arrived 3 days ago and still needed to be filed. A blue weekly pill organizer sat open on the counter. Rosie's hands moved through the familiar choreography, crush the blood pressure tablet with the back of the spoon. Check the shape of the white fragments, confirm the dosage, sweep the powder into the small cup of applesauce that made the medicine go down without complaint. She had the practiced hands of a caregiver. She also had the tired eyes of a woman who had been useful to everyone for too long. The spiral notebook was already open on the counter beside the coffee mug, its pages covered in Rosie's careful, even handwriting. Date, time, medication administered, blood pressure reading, mood observation, sleep quality from the night before. She had been keeping these logs for 14 months. Not because anyone asked her to, but because she was a CNA and documentation was the closest thing to certainty her profession offered. She pressed the pen down firmly and wrote the morning's reading 124/78. Within normal range. Good. June was at the kitchen table in her pale green cardigan, both hands wrapped around her mug, one finger marking a place in the newspaper. The morning light came through the blinds in thin horizontal bars and fell across the oak table, across the older woman's reading glasses, across the dry arrangement of silk flowers in the centerpiece that Rosie meant to replace when she found the time. June turned a page. The paper rustled with the particular authority of someone who had read the news every morning for 60 years and did not intend to stop. "You write down the weather, too?" June asked without looking up. Rosie glanced out the window at the low gray sky and the wet sidewalk and the bare maple at the corner of the yard. "Only if it tries to kill us," she said. June made a small sound that was almost a laugh and went back to her paper. The coffee maker finished its sputtering and went quiet. The heater in the hallway ticked to life, sending warm air through the vent near the baseboard. In the window glass, Rosie caught her own reflection for half a second. 34 years old, ponytail. Slightly off-center, hospital-grade compression socks already pulled up under her jeans, and looked away before the image could say anything useful to her. She had spent most of her adult life in this posture. Useful, present, slightly off to the side of every room she entered. Her mother had 3 children, and Rosie occupied the particular territory of the third. Not the firstborn, who commanded attention by virtue of precedent, and not the middle, who fought for it, but the youngest, who had learned early that the smoothest path was to become indispensable. She cooked when there was cooking to be done. She drove when someone needed a ride. She stayed when staying was required. The arrangement had been presented to her as love, and she had accepted it as such for longer than she could comfortably name. Her inner voice had learned to speak in a register no one else could hear. If I stay useful, they will finally treat me like I belong. The thought was old enough to have lost its sharp edges, worn smooth by repetition into something she no longer questioned. It had become simply the way things were. But usefulness, she was beginning to understand, had its own particular architecture. Walls made of obligation, a ceiling made of routine, a door that only opened in one direction. Daniel Hale called a family meeting that evening. The gathering assembled itself at his split-level house across town. In the comfortable, habitual way of families who had been doing this long enough to have stopped noticing what was missing. Boots lined the entryway in a crooked row. Casserole dishes crowded the kitchen island. Children trailed tablet charging cables across the living room carpet like small, absorbed explorers. On the coffee table, a printed Hawaii itinerary had been laid flat under a water glass. Its photographs of blue water and resort balconies made to look like evidence of a good decision already made. Rosie stood near the doorway in her thrift store coat. She still smelled faintly of antiseptic wipes and lavender lotion from June's evening routine. She had driven directly from Maple Ridge without stopping to change, which meant she arrived holding the specific texture of her work life while everyone else had shed theirs at the door. Daniel was already in the center of the room when she arrived. He had a way of standing that suggested he had recently decided the outcome of something and was only now performing the consultation. His smile arrived before his sentences. He spoke first about family time and the importance of rest, the way a person leads with the uncontroversial before approaching what they actually mean. He mentioned the beach itinerary. He mentioned the resort pool. He mentioned that everyone needed a real vacation this year, given everything. Then his voice dropped precisely one register, achieving the tone of a man delivering difficult news. He said that June's memory had been causing concern lately. He said it gently. He said it with his head slightly tilted, the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis to which he already knows the family's response. He spoke about stability, about professional assessment, about the emotional difficulty of watching a parent change. Then he said Rosie's name, and the room's attention moved toward her the way attention always moved in this family past her. Rather than toward her, like light bending around an object that doesn't quite fit the frame. With your training, Daniel said, you're the obvious choice. Ethan checked something on his phone. Megan adjusted the bracelet on her left wrist, a small, private gesture of occupying her hands. Linda, on the far couch, straightened a throw pillow that required no straightening. The room was full of bodies, and the silence around Rosie was absolute. She heard herself speak before she had decided to. I've never seen the ocean. The sentence came out lighter than she intended, polite almost, just a plain statement of fact about her own life. But the words seemed to locate something in the room that everyone had agreed not to look at, and for one moment the air changed. Daniel recovered first. He laughed comfortable, dismissive, the laugh of a man who had never needed to be careful with another person's feelings. You're not coming, Rosie. Somebody has to stay and babysit Grandma. A few people smiled uneasily. No one said anything. June, sitting in her armchair with a cup of tea, watched Rosie with an expression that was not pity. It was closer to calculation. When Rosie crossed the room to fix the blanket that had slipped from June's knees, the older woman caught her wrist with fingers that were papery but surprisingly strong. Write down everything now. The voice was barely above a whisper, pressed close against Rosie's ear, intimate and urgent. Rosie straightened slowly. Her heart was ticking hard against her ribs as she turned back toward the room. where the children were already swiping through snorkeling photographs on someone's phone and the house smelled of pot roast and something older, something that had been simmering beneath every family meal for years. That night, Rosie stood alone in June's guest room with her coat still on. The radiator hissed and clanked in the wall. The street outside was quiet, the November dark, the particular shade of nothing that comes after families disband and leave their warmth behind. She told herself the words he had said were cruel but ordinary. That men like Daniel made those small, precise cuts without thinking, the way people trim hangnails reflexively, without remorse. She looked at her wrist. The red mark June's grip had left was fading already, but she thought about what it meant that an old woman in a cardigan had been holding on that hard. And for that long, without anyone in that room thinking to ask why. Write down everything now. She opened the spiral notebook and began. 4 days passed the way November days do in the mountains, slowly, gray at the edges, smelling of wood, smoke and damp leaves, and the particular cold that settles into old houses through the baseboards and the window frames no matter how well you seal them. Rosie moved through her routines with her usual precision. Morning vitals, medication log, breakfast, the walk around the block that June insisted on despite the cold. Her breath visible in small clouds, her posture deliberately upright, as if the neighborhood were watching and she intended to give it something worth watching. On Sunday, Daniel came by after church. He always came by after church, which Rosie had long understood was strategic rather than devotional. Sunday morning attendance gave him a particular veneer-pressed blazer, cologne. The moral authority of someone who had spent the earlier part of the day in a pew. He arrived carrying store-bought muffins from the Harris Teeter Bakery, the plastic clamshell still labeled with a sticker price he had not bothered to peel off, and he smiled at June in the doorway. With the warmth of a son performing concern for an audience that included himself. Rosie was in the kitchen finishing the lunch dishes when she heard him pass down the hall. He went directly to June's home office, as he always did. It was a small room off the back hallway, its walls lined with old bookshelves. A framed cross-stitch from June's teaching years, and a wooden desk that had belonged to June's own mother. Daniel moved through that room the way certain men move through spaces that belong to other people comfortably, without asking, with the unconscious confidence of someone who has decided that access and ownership are essentially the same thing. Rosie came around the corner with 2 mugs of coffee and found him startled. It was the first time in her life she had seen him surprised by anything. And the surprise lasted only a fraction of a second before his expression reassembled itself. But she had already seen it, the top drawer standing open, a receipt lying half-covered beneath a yellow legal pad, his hand moving fast to turn it over. Not fast enough. The heading had been clearly visible before his palm flattened over it. 3 clean words across the top of the document in a standard billing typeface: Sunrise Pines Memory Care. Below the header, in black type that she had processed in the 2 seconds available to her, a deposit received. November 3rd. The amount sat in her memory like a splinter: $12,500. November 3rd was the day of the family meeting. The same day he called everyone together and told them about Hawaii and lowered his voice to the register of concern. And said Rosie's name like she was a fixture being kept in place by obligation. Knock first, Daniel said. His voice had tightened just enough to reveal that the smile was load-bearing. Rosie set the second mug down on the edge of the desk because her fingers had gone cold and she did not entirely trust them. The ceramic made a small, hard sound against the wood. I was bringing coffee, she said. For family. He did not answer. She left the room. That night she sat on the edge of the guest bed for a long time, turning the phrase over. A deposit on a memory care facility placed on the same day he had called a family meeting. Told everyone Rosie wasn't invited to the vacation, and assigned her to stay with June. The deposit was not an inquiry. Deposits were not made for facilities someone was merely considering. A deposit was a timeline. A commitment. A first installment on an ending. She opened the spiral notebook and wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. The CVS on Merriman Avenue had fluorescent lighting that made everyone look faintly unwell. And Rosie had been coming there long enough that the pharmacist with the silver-framed glasses recognized her on sight. Monday morning, the line was short. Rosie had June's refill bag over one shoulder and the same spiral notebook tucked under her arm out of habit. The way a nurse carries a clipboard, because you never knew when something needed to be written down immediately. The pharmacist scanned the first bottle and paused. Trazodone's new for her, right? Rosie's hand stopped moving. What trazodone? The woman turned the amber prescription bottle and pointed at the label. Sleep support, 50 milligrams. Prescribed by Dr. Paul Mercer. Rosie stared at it the way a person stares at something that is simultaneously familiar and completely wrong, the way you look at your own reflection in a mirror hung at the wrong angle. Who picked this up? She asked. The pharmacist's keys clacked on the keyboard. Daniel Hale, authorized contact. Yesterday, 2:23 p.m. The plastic refill bag crinkled in Rosie's hand. Outside, rain had begun to mist across the parking lot, turning every tail light into a smeared red streak against the asphalt. She stood at the counter for an extra moment, running through what she knew in the systematic way her CNA training had given her. Trazodone, an antidepressant frequently prescribed off-label as a sedative for elderly patients with dementia-related sleep disturbance or nighttime agitation. A reasonable medication in specific clinical circumstances. In June's case, completely without clinical basis. Rosie knew June's sleep patterns the way she knew her own because she had been logging them for over a year. Normal, consistent, occasionally interrupted by a trip to the bathroom at 200 a.m. Noted, unremarkable. No wandering, no agitation, no insomnia beyond what any 79-year-old might experience on a cold night. She knew this because the blue notebook was sitting in the passenger seat of her car. She drove home with both hands on the wheel and the prescription bag in her lap and the sound of rain on the windshield replacing every other thought she had. That afternoon, Rosie laid everything on the kitchen table. The new prescription bottle, June's regular pill organizer, the Medicare Advantage denial letter from October that Linda had once mailed to June's address rather than her own accidentally. She had said, though the nature of the error had never been fully explained. An overdue electric bill that had similarly appeared in June's mail stack at a moment that corresponded to a period when June's checking account had been notably active. Rosie set each item in a row, equidistant, the way she organized evidence in her mind by presence, not by implication. Letting the pattern speak without forcing it. She opened the notebook to the sleep section and flipped backward through the months. September, August, July, June. Each entry the same: sleep normal, no disturbance, woke once for water, no confusion reported, mood clear in the morning. She read every page. She counted nights. Not once in 14 months had she recorded anything that would justify a standing prescription for a sedative sleep aid in a patient. With no diagnosed sleep disorder and no dementia diagnosis on record, she set the trazodone bottle down beside the notebook and looked at the two objects side by side. The bottle said one story. The notebook said another. Only one of them had been written down in real time by a person who was actually present. The following Sunday, Daniel came by in the early afternoon with the particular energy of a man who has already decided how something will go. He offered to help with June's evening medications, framing it the way he always framed things: as generosity, as participation, as a son stepping up. Rosie was in the backyard with the trash bins when she heard him in the kitchen. By the time she came inside, he was already in the living room with June, one hand on her shoulder. By 300 p.m., June was asleep on the couch. Not the light, dignified nap of an old woman who had tired naturally in the afternoon warmth. Her lips were parted. Her crossword puzzle had slid from her lap to the floor, landing face down, pen still clipped to the cover. Her hands lay open at her sides. Rosie stood in the doorway and watched the quality of the sleep, the depth of it, the limpness. The faint, even breathing that belonged to chemical sedation rather than natural rest, and felt something cold and professional take shape behind her sternum. She counted the trazodone tablets in the new bottle. Then she counted them again. 2 more missing than there should have been. At 7:30, June woke confused and embarrassed. She asked whether she had missed supper. She asked twice. Her eyes had the particular unfocused quality of someone trying to assemble the afternoon from fragments. And Rosie watched her face do that work and felt a controlled, precise fury building beneath her ribs. She sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open and wrote without pausing. Visit time. Daniel's words at arrival. Drowsiness onset observed at approximately 2:47 p.m. Wake time. Disorientation duration 22 minutes. Questions asked upon waking. Current pill count. Discrepancy from previous count. The spiral binding pressed into the heel of her hand while she wrote. Outside, 6 o'clock church bells carried across the November air in the particular way bells do when the trees are bare and the sky is low. Inside, the truth was accumulating in ink. 2 weeks moved through the house on Maple Ridge in a particular. Silence, the kind of silence that accumulates when a person is paying close attention to everything and saying almost nothing. Rosie cooked and cleaned and logged and drove and administered medications and answered phone calls and folded laundry. And did not say, to anyone, what she was beginning to understand. The notebook filled. A second notebook was started. She labeled both by date and kept them in the drawer of her own nightstand rather than the kitchen counter. Which she now understood was not as private as it had always seemed. Daniel called it a Sunday dinner to discuss next steps. The phrasing was deliberate. Next steps was the kind of language that implied process, inevitability, collective decision-making already in motion. It arrived by group text on a Thursday morning, casual and cheerful. Accompanied by a note from Linda about bringing the good tablecloth and a follow-up from Megan asking whether anyone was doing a gluten-free option. Rosie read the text standing at June's kitchen counter and felt the architecture of the thing before she could fully name it. The dinner was not a discussion. It was a staging ground. She spent all of Saturday preparing for it. She brined the chicken by hand and made the lasagna from scratch the way June had taught her. Using whole tomatoes and fresh basil and the heavy ceramic pan that had to be handled carefully because the glaze had started to chip at one corner. She vacuumed the dining room. She wiped down the chair legs. She ironed the good napkins and folded them into the shapes June liked, simple and neat, nothing theatrical. When her siblings arrived in the early afternoon, they came dressed the way guests arrive at someone else's labor: bright scarves, good shoes. A store-bought dessert carried in both hands like an offering. Ethan and his wife came first, tracking mud on the entry mat without stopping. Megan arrived 20 minutes later with 2 of her children and the studied warmth. She applied to family occasions the way she applied lipstick carefully, for the effect it produced in other people. Linda appeared last, carrying a candle in a gift bag and wearing an expression of strained composure that Rosie had been reading since childhood. Rosie took their coats. She brought drinks. She finished the bread in the oven and sliced it. While the dining room filled with voices and the particular noise of a family that had never been required to be quiet around her. June came downstairs slowly but without assistance. She had dressed with care: pearl earrings, the navy cardigan with the small embroidered collar, a tissue in her sleeve. Her posture was deliberate. Rosie noticed it the way June moved through the room with the measured precision of a woman who understood that her dignity was currently under negotiation. And had decided, quietly, to make that negotiation as expensive as possible for anyone who tried it. She carried her own sweet tea. She sat without being guided. She looked alert and direct and entirely herself. Daniel was watching her with an expression Rosie had seen before on medical charts but not on a son's face. It was not concern. It was the faint irritation of a person whose plan requires a certain performance and is noting, with displeasure, that the performance isn't materializing. He waited until everyone had served themselves and the room had settled into the comfortable noise of eating. Then he placed the brochure on the table. It landed beside June's plate with a flat, deliberate sound, glossy and pastel-colored, the kind of design that used words like compassionate and community and professional memory support in a font that was meant to look warm. Rosie saw June's hand go very still against her fork. "It's time to be realistic," Daniel said. The room quieted in increments. Forks lowered. Chewing slowed. Children registered the change in register and went still the way children do when adult conversation shifts into a frequency they recognize as serious. "Mom's not safe here anymore." He said it with the practiced weight of someone delivering a diagnosis, not a conclusion he had reached, but a fact the room must now absorb. Rosie means well, but she's too emotionally involved to see how bad it's gotten. Rosie set her fork down carefully. The chair legs scraped when she stood, faster than she had intended. The sound was too loud for the room and she felt it in her face, the heat rushing up, the sudden inadequacy of her body in the space. "That's not true," she said. Her voice came out thinner than she wanted. It did not carry the authority she had felt in her chest a moment before. It arrived in the room like something that needed to apologize for existing. Daniel opened his hands in mock patience, the gesture of a man making room for the feelings of someone who doesn't understand what's happening. "Rosie." Her name in his mouth was a gentle correction. "You work in elder care. You should understand this better than anyone. Sometimes family members get too attached. They start missing the obvious." The heat in her face intensified. She was aware of Megan not meeting her eyes, her gaze fixed on her own plate with the particular focus of someone who has practiced not being present. Ethan was looking into his water glass as if the ice had become suddenly important. The table was full of people who knew her entire life, and not one of them turned toward her. Linda said it quietly, almost gently, the way a mother can make the cruelest sentence sound like care. "Don't make this harder." The words arrived with the specific weight of a thing said many times before, worn smooth and precise by repetition. Rosie felt them land in a place she could not immediately locate, somewhere between her shoulder blades, somewhere old. Daniel slid a form partly out from a manila folder on the seat of the chair beside him. He seemed to think better of it before showing it fully, and pushed it back in when Rosie took a half step forward. But she had already seen what she needed to see. 3 words across the top of the visible page: capacity assessment intake. His thumb pressing flat over a physician's name. The lower corner of the document showing the Sunrise Pines letterhead, the same header she had glimpsed 2 weeks ago in the home office. He had not brought that folder to show them. He had brought it to confirm to himself that it existed. That small, reflexive hiding motion thumb over the name folder back into the leather briefcase that sat open on the chair told her more precisely than any speech could have. He had already scheduled the assessment. He had already spoken to the physician. The dinner was not a discussion about what to do next. The dinner was a notification that it had already been done. June watched all of it. Rosie noticed her grandmother's posture during the exchange: perfectly still, back straight, one hand resting on the stem of her glass. She watched Daniel. She watched Rosie. She watched the room respond and rearrange itself around the performance. Once, very briefly, June's hand tightened around the glass stem and then released. The chandelier hummed overhead. Sauce cooled on plates. Nobody ate. I wanted one person to say my name like I was a daughter, not hired help. The thought moved through Rosie with the particular ache of something true and useless. The dining room smelled of basil and melted cheese and something older than both, the accumulated residue of years of family meals, in which her place at the table had never been fully settled. "I live here," Rosie said. Her voice had found a different register now, not thin, not apologetic, but frayed at the edges in a way she could not entirely control. Her eyes had gone wet and she knew it, could feel it, but she did not look away. "And none of you know her better than I do." Daniel laughed. It was softer than before, and worse. "You live here because you don't have much else going on." The sentence arrived cleanly, without embellishment, and did what shouting never could. It named the shape of her life in the room where the shape had always been known, but never spoken, and the knowing of it went through her like cold water, fast and everywhere at once. June's fork hit her plate. The sharp metallic sound cut through the room. June did not say anything. She simply brought the fork down against the china with a precise, deliberate crack, and in the silence that followed, every face turned toward her. She looked at Rosie. Her expression was not pity. It was not even sympathy. It was something harder and more useful, a recognition between two people that the same thing has been done to both of them, and that now they both know it. Rosie left the table before she could break in front of them. The kitchen was dark except for the under-cabinet light left on over the stove. She gripped the edge of the stainless steel sink until the cold bit into her palms and the shaking in her hands transferred into the metal and stilled. Through the pass-through window she could hear the dining room reassemble itself, chair creaks, silverware resuming, a child's voice asking something and being hushed, Daniel's voice continuing as if nothing had occurred worth stopping for. On her way upstairs, she passed the chair where the leather briefcase sat. Daniel was not looking. She slowed for 1 step, 2 steps, and heard the zipper close. That sound, small, mechanical, the sound of something being sealed, seemed to carry all the way up the staircase, following her through the hallway. Sitting with her in the dark of the upper landing while the voices below blurred together into a single indistinguishable drone. She stood at the window and looked at the maple tree and the streetlight and the empty November street. And understood that this was no longer about whether she was wrong. She had documentation. She had dates and pill counts and timing and a deposit receipt and a folder full of paperwork that described a woman she had never, not once, observed. The question now was not whether something terrible was happening. The question was how quickly she could make it impossible to complete. The house on Maple Ridge felt enormous after everyone left. Not in the way of a large house with rooms to spare, but in the way of a space from which warmth has been quickly withdrawn, leaving the walls and furniture to absorb the absence. Someone had left a child's juice box on the coffee table, sweating onto a cloth coaster in a slow, indifferent ring. The lasagna had hardened in its pan on the stove. The good napkins lay crumpled beside plates that had been pushed back but not cleared. Rosie stood alone under the kitchen's overhead light in her socks, listening to the clock above the pantry tick with the specific patience of an object that has no investment in the human drama unfolding beneath it. She opened June's mail the way she always did on Sunday evenings. The stack was ordinary at first. A utility statement, a church pledge envelope from First Methodist, the return address stamped with a small gold cross. A piece of bulk mail from a home security company that didn't know June. Had lived alone for 12 years and had no intention of changing her locks for a monthly subscription. Rosie sorted automatically, her hands moving through the routine while her mind was still partially upstairs in the sound of that zipper closing. Then her hands stopped. The long-term care intake packet was positioned third from the bottom, sandwiched between a church bulletin and a dental insurance explanation of benefits as if its placement were casual, accidental. The result of ordinary mail delivery rather than deliberate insertion. The return address was Sunrise Pines. Rosie's pulse jumped once, hard, and she set the other envelopes down. She also found a statement for a care fund account she had never been shown. The account existed under June's name and social security number, funded over many years from a separate savings line. Rosie had not known about not because she was uninformed about June's finances generally, but because this account had been kept apart, managed separately, referenced in no conversation Rosie had been part of. She sat down at the table with both pages spread flat under her palms and smoothed them as if more pressure might make the numbers less precise. The balance had dropped by tens of thousands in a single month. She found herself in the home office before midnight. She had not consciously planned to go there. She had finished the dishes and turned off the kitchen light and walked down the hall, intending to check the thermostat, and then she was standing in front of June's desk with both hands at her sides and the room dark except for the pale reach of the street lamp through the Venetian blinds. She knelt beside the bottom left drawer. The metal rail scraped softly when she pulled it open. Inside the drawer, behind a hanging file of old insurance documents and the tax returns from the last 3 years that she had helped June organize, sat a 2-inch manila folder. The label across the tab had been written in Daniel's neat block print June Medical Planning. Rosie lifted it onto the desk surface and turned on the small lamp. She read the intake paperwork first. The clinical description of June Hale began on the 3rd page and continued through the 6th. Late-stage dementia, frequently nonverbal, episodes of aggression, including toward caregivers, significant wandering behavior, requiring overnight monitoring, unable to reliably recognize immediate family members. Each sentence was present in the document with the authority of assessed fact, written in the careful, passive clinical voice that bureaucratic systems use to make subjective determinations sound like objective findings. Rosie read the section 3 times. The first time, she read it for comprehension, following the language, parsing the clinical terms, understanding what was being claimed. The second time, she read it against her own records, matching the dates of the alleged behaviors against her notebook entries for those same dates, looking for any overlap, any gap, any single instance in which her documentation showed anything that could have been interpreted to produce what the intake form described. There was nothing, not one entry in 14 months that corresponded to wandering, aggression, nonverbal episodes, or failure to recognize family. The third time she read it, she understood that this was not a mistake. Behind the intake forms sat documents she needed a moment to identify before she could process them. Bank statements, transfer records, a page of wire transactions printed from an online banking interface, each line annotated in a different handwriting, not Daniel's block print. But something looser, faster, less careful, as if the annotation had been done quickly. The numbers were substantial. $8,600 transferred to an entity called Blue Ridge Family Travel LLC. $11,420 categorized in the transaction description as respite transport and therapeutic lodging. $18,000 listed under caregiver reimbursement. Rosie sat with that last figure for a long time. $18,000. No one had ever paid her $1 for the 14 months she had spent crushing pills and logging vitals and driving June to appointments and sleeping with one part of her brain. Always listening for the sounds of a woman who needed her. She had reduced her clinic hours to part-time to be available. She had used her personal grocery budget to supplement June's kitchen when the pantry ran low. She had not taken a vacation, had not made a trip, had not sat at an airport gate. With a printed itinerary in her hands and someone waiting for her at the other end. She opened her laptop at the kitchen table. Her bank account was on one tab, embarrassingly thin, the specific kind of thin that comes not from recklessness, but from extended, grinding sacrifice that has no official category in anyone else's accounting. Her 401k statement was in a digital folder with a red notice about hardship withdrawal penalties. She had been ignoring because looking at it directly required energy she rarely had left over. She had once, in a bad week in September, opened the withdrawal form and stared at the penalty calculation before closing the browser and making herself a cup of tea. On another tab, the care fund had financed resort excursions. Is this how my life ends, used up and erased on someone else's paperwork? The thought had no drama in it. It arrived quietly, in the voice of a person asking a genuine question about a specific and measurable outcome. The refrigerator motor kicked on, loud in the kitchen silence, the particular household noise that marks late nights when everything else goes still. Rosie pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes for a moment. Then she said, aloud, to no one, no. I will read every page with my name in the room. She built the first spreadsheet before 100 a.m. Claim versus documented reality, laid out in columns. Dates of alleged incidents on the left. Her own notebook entries for the same dates on the right. The discrepancy was total. She then built a medication timeline using the pharmacy pickup records she had collected, cross-referenced with sedation episodes she had noted, cross-referenced with Daniel's Sunday visit dates. The correlation was exact. The dates aligned with a precision that could not be accidental. She printed screenshots of the bank records. She printed the intake forms. She copied 3 emails from a shared family account. She had been included on without, she now understood, anyone thinking carefully about what it meant to include her. She went to the supply closet and found a box of old plastic tab dividers from her CNA coursework. The edges cracked from years of sitting in a plastic bin, and she began building a second binder. The first binder was blue. She labeled the second one red. At approximately 155 a.m., Rosie found the deed. It was filed in a separate hanging folder near the back of the drawer, behind June's original mortgage documents for the Maple Ridge house, behind the water department right-of-way agreement from 2009. The deed concerned a rental property on Elm Street, a small duplex June had owned for 22 years and rented to a pair of retired teachers who had lived there without incident or complaint. The deed had been transferred 4 months ago. The new owner of record was listed as a real estate holding company Rosie had never heard of. June's signature was at the bottom. Rosie studied it for a long time. She got up from the desk and went to the kitchen drawer, the one near the telephone where June kept birthday cards, expired coupons, and the small correspondence of a life conducted by hand rather than screen. She found 6 of June's cards, 2 signed to Rosie directly, 1 to Ethan, the others to friends from church, and brought them back to the desk. She laid them out beside the deed under the lamp. June Hale's natural signature was small and Deliberate, the handwriting of a woman who had spent 30 years writing carefully in grade books and attendance records, who associated legibility with professional respect. The letters were even, the loops tight, the end of each word finished cleanly. The signature on the deed was larger, looser. The letters leaned differently. The pen pressure was heavier than June's. The final flourish at the end of Hale went in the wrong direction, not upward and closed, but downward and open, as if a different hand had learned to approximate the name rather than write it. Rosie pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth. The sound that wanted to come out was not a cry exactly. It was something more fundamental, the sound a person makes when the last category of innocent explanation disappears. And what remains is simply the structure of what was done and who did it. She stayed at the table for another hour, building the spreadsheet until the columns were complete. And the cross-references were documented, and the forgery comparison had been photographed with her phone and added to the red binder in its own plastic sleeve. She worked with the focused discipline of someone who has converted despair into method, because method was the only tool she currently possessed. And she intended to use it until it wore out or it worked. She fell asleep at the table just before dawn with her cheek against a printed bank statement and one hand resting flat on the evidence binder. When she woke to the smell of coffee, her neck hurt. Her face carried the creased impression of the page it had been resting against, lines of financial data pressed briefly into skin, already fading, but visible for a moment in the bathroom mirror when she stood to wash her face. She looked at herself. She looked at the page lines. She thought about everything that had been written on paper and hidden in drawers and signed with another person's hand, and she understood with a certainty that settled something in her chest permanently. She was the only person in this family who had been keeping records of the real story. That was no longer a disadvantage. Friends, what a story we've found ourselves in. Rosie Hale came to Asheville to care for her grandmother June, steady, quiet, useful. She cooked the meals, kept the logs, stayed behind while her family booked flights to Hawaii. And what did she find waiting for her in those bottom drawers? Forged deeds, fraudulent care forms, a daughter's sacrificed wages repackaged as someone else's reimbursement. Daniel Hale thought he had the perfect plan, and maybe he did, for a family that was willing to look the other way. But here's what he never counted on: Rosie had been writing everything down. Every date, every pill count, every lie, right there in blue ink. Stay with us, friends. Because the woman they left behind has been building something. And it's almost ready. June found her at the kitchen table that evening. The table looked different in the late afternoon light, not like a kitchen surface anymore but like a command post. Its wood grain buried under stacked folders, color-coded with the plastic tabs from Rosie's CNA binders, the pages organized by category rather than date. Medical evidence on the left. Financial transfers in the center. Property documents on the right. The blue spiral notebook lay open in the middle of it all, the most recent page covered in entries that had shifted tone, no longer the clean, observational language of a care log, but something more urgent, more prosecutorial, the writing of a person building a case rather than a record. June set down 2 mugs of tea without comment and looked at the table for a long moment before she looked at Rosie. How much have you found? Rosie's hands stopped moving above a stack of pharmacy printouts. The question was precise, not what are you doing or what is all this, but exactly the question a person asks when they already know the approximate answer and want to know whether someone else has caught up. Rosie put the papers down. Enough to know he has a facility deposit, a forged deed, a fraudulent intake assessment, and a doctor who wrote diagnoses that don't exist in 400 days of notes, she said. Not enough to know what to do with all of it. June lowered herself into the chair across from her, both hands flat on the table for a moment, then folded. She looked directly at Rosie the way she had always looked at students, who were capable of more than they were currently performing, with patience that had an edge to it, with clarity that expected clarity in return. Enough to know Daniel wants me drugged, declared incompetent, and put away, June said. Not enough to know I expected him to try. The sentence moved through Rosie in layers. First as information, then as history, then as something that rearranged what she had believed about the past year, about who had been protecting whom, about what had been happening in this house. while she was logging blood pressure readings and rationing her grocery budget and telling herself she was probably overreacting. June led her upstairs to the bedroom closet. She knelt with more difficulty than pride would allow, one hand on the closet doorframe for balance, the other reaching beneath a stack of folded blankets she had clearly arranged for exactly this purpose. The fireproof box was small, the kind sold in office supply stores, designed to preserve documents through 30 minutes of direct flame. The metal latch clicked when June opened it. Inside, years of bank statements, some highlighted in June's careful handwriting. Photocopied deeds, handwritten letters on plain white paper, addressed to the bank in June's voice, requesting official confirmation of account activity. A fold of papers held together with a binder clip that turned out to be June's own chronological log of suspicious interactions. And, wrapped in a white hand towel at the bottom of the box, a digital voice recorder. "I started keeping records in March," June said. Rosie looked up from the box. March was 8 months ago. Before the family meeting, before the pharmacy, before the Sunday dinner, before the bottom drawer. "He pushed a power of attorney too hard in the spring," June continued. "He brought forms I hadn't asked for, sat across from me at this very table, and explained them too quickly. Good men don't rush old women to sign what they won't explain." She said it plainly, without bitterness, the observation of someone who has lived long enough to know the difference between impatience and intent. "So I called the bank the next morning. And I started making copies." Rosie ran her fingers slowly across the highlighted bank statements, reading the notations in the margins, dates circled, amounts underlined, a question mark beside a transfer that corresponded exactly to one in the red binder downstairs. She felt a shame she had not expected. Not the shame of having done something wrong, but the shame of having believed, for months, that she was the only one paying attention. June had been paying attention since before Rosie had seen the first receipt. Then came the memories, surfacing in pieces the way they do when a new context makes old images legible. Spring. Daniel at this table with legal forms spread over the floral vinyl tablecloth, a rainstorm tapping the kitchen windows behind him. "It's just paperwork, Mom. Standard stuff." June's refusal, quiet and firm. Daniel's smile thinning to something less certain. Rosie remembered being in the hallway at the edge of that conversation and thinking it was tax preparation because he had said tax preparation. And she had accepted the word for the thing. Last Christmas. Ethan's voice above the clink of glasses and the smell of pine candles and the noise of children. "Old house. Like this probably has enough equity to buy us all first-class seats." Laughter. Glasses raised. June's smile tightening for exactly 1 second before it relaxed. Rosie had seen that second and not known what to do with it. And she had filed it in the category of things that made her vaguely uncomfortable and could not be named. She could name it now. June pressed the play button on the recorder. Daniel's voice filled the small bedroom, flat and deliberate, the voice of a man speaking to someone he has decided no longer has the standing to resist him. "If you won't cooperate, I'll have you declared incompetent. You understand what that means. I'll have it done before spring." The recording hissed softly for a moment after the words stopped. Then it clicked off. The silence that followed was of the kind that comes after something irrevocable has been heard. Rosie felt her chest tighten, not with surprise. Not anymore, but with the specific physical sensation of a truth that has been operating invisibly for months finally becoming audible. The closet smelled of cedar and old wool. The crocheted bedspread caught the last of the afternoon light. Everything in this room was the same as it had always been, and everything in it had changed. "All this time," Rosie said, "I thought I was the only one being used." June squeezed her hand. The grip was the same one from the family meeting, papery, fierce, older than it looked. "You weren't waiting to be saved," Rosie said, the tears coming without warning or apology. "You were waiting for a witness." "Exactly," June said. The word was warm and certain and devastating in the way that only simple, true things can be. June told her then about the church friend, a retired paralegal who knew what questions to ask, and about the Adult Protective Services contact made in November. December 16th. An independent evaluation scheduled for 2 days after Daniel's arranged physician visit. "Let him think he's winning," June said. "Arrogant men get sloppy when they think the ending belongs to them." Rosie sat with the open box in her hands and looked at this woman. She had been caring for in one direction only, and understood that the story she had been living in was not the story she had believed herself to be living in. It was larger than a cruel father and a neglected daughter. It was about two women who had been handed the same invisibility by the same man and had each, separately and then together, refused it. That night Rosie updated the binder with a hand that no longer shook. The pain was present. It had not gone anywhere. But it had changed its nature, no longer the diffuse, helpless pain of someone being acted upon, but the focused, purposeful pain of someone who has stopped absorbing what is happening and started directing their response to it. She wrote for 2 hours. When she finished, she looked at the binder with its color-coded tabs and its photographed forgery comparisons and its spreadsheet cross-references, and she thought, this is what we kept instead of being kept. The next 10 days had the quality of a clock being wound. Rosie moved through them with a precision she had not previously known she possessed, not the familiar precision of caregiving, which was methodical and patient and oriented toward another person's comfort, but something harder and more directed. The precision of a person who has decided that accuracy is the only form of power currently available to her and intends to use every unit of it. She called the pharmacy on Monday morning from the car, parked in the lot of the Ingalls grocery store on Leicester Highway with the engine running for warmth. She requested official dispensing records for the trazodone prescription, citing her role as June's documented primary caregiver. The pharmacist, a different one than before, younger, less harried, confirmed the prescription and its pickup history. While Rosie wrote every detail down in the margin of a gas station receipt she found in the cup holder. She would type it later. She typed everything later. She called the bank on Tuesday. She called the county records office on Wednesday. She called Drive Mercer's clinic on Thursday and listened carefully to the way the receptionist's voice changed when she gave her name, a small, almost imperceptible tightening, a half-second pause before the standard response, and wrote that down too, because tone was data even when it was not documentable. She requested transaction histories and received them by fax at the office supply store on Tunnel Road. Paying per page, feeding the paper into a folder that was already labeled before it was filled. She requested prescription pickup logs. She called the county deed office and asked for a certified copy of the Elm Street transfer, citing her interest as a family member of the grantor, and was informed it would be ready in 3 to 5 business days. She drove there herself on the 4th day and waited. June's dining room table had become something unrecognizable. The centerpiece was gone. The good tablecloth was folded on the sideboard. In their place, the table held 4 distinct working sections, organized by category and by sequence: medical documentation on the upper left, financial transfers on the upper right, property records along the bottom left, and a growing pile of communications evidence on the bottom right. Communications evidence included printed emails from the family group chain, screenshots from June's online banking alerts, a voicemail transcript Rosie had typed out by hand from June's answering machine, Daniel's voice, confirming the December 19th intake date to someone at sunrise who was not June. Winter rain tapped the dining room windows in the particular irregular rhythm of mountain weather, and the printer on the sideboard ran almost continuously. Rosie highlighted timestamps in yellow. She circled signatures in red. She pulled up the photograph of the deed comparison on her phone and zoomed into the terminal flourish of the H in Hale. Then printed the comparison side by side at 150% of original size and added it to the property section under a tab she had labeled Signature Discrepancy Elm Street Deed. She also documented herself. This was the part she had resisted: the personal financial record, which required her to look at her own circumstances with the same unflinching specificity she had applied to everything else. Reduced work hours documented with pay stubs. Lost wages compared to full-time CNA rate calculated and entered into the spreadsheet. Credit card balances retrieved and added. The past due car insurance notice from the bowl by the door opened, photographed, filed. The 401k hardship withdrawal form she had once filled out and abandoned retrieved from her browser history. Printed, placed in a section she labeled Economic Harm Personal. Because the truth had layers. Because what had been done to June had been partially built on what had been done to Rosie, and the scheme required both victims to complete itself. She met James Carter on a Tuesday morning. His office was on the second floor of a building on Broadway above a hardware store, accessible by a narrow staircase that smelled of sawdust and metal. The office itself was modest bookshelves, a wooden desk, 2 client chairs with cushions that had been recovering from excessive use for at least a decade. Carter was 63, broad-shouldered, with the unhurried manner of a man who had spent long enough in elder law practice to know that being calm in the presence of a crisis was itself a form of competence. He read in silence, not skimming reading, page by page, with the focused attention of someone who understands that detail is where the truth lives. 11 minutes passed. Rosie counted them on the clock above the bookshelves because she had nothing else to do with her hands and could not speak. Carter turned from one tabbed section to another with the careful respect of a person handling something that matters. At the end of the 11th minute, he set the binder flat on the desk and looked up. "This isn't a misunderstanding," he said. "This is a paper trail." Rosie exhaled slowly. The room smelled of coffee and lemon wood polish and old paper, and Carter's sentence landed in the center of her chest. Like oxygen arriving after a long moment without it. He walked her through the legal landscape. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Elder abuse. Fraudulent medical representations. Forgery of a real estate instrument. Each category carried specific civil and criminal implications. He was direct without being sensational, which was what she needed, not consolation but competence, not sympathy but architecture. He recommended contacting Adult Protective Services, which June had already set in motion. He recommended a protective order for the Care Fund. He recommended notifying Sunrise Pines and the County Medical Board. He gave her the name of an APS investigator he had worked with previously, Lauren Pike. He said, "Make the call today." Rosie made the call from the parking lot of the hardware store below, sitting in her car with the engine off and the windows fogging in the November cold. Lauren Pike answered on the second ring with the flat, attentive tone of someone who has learned to conduct triage by voice alone. Rosie explained the situation in the organized sequence she had rehearsed on the drive over the documentation, the dates, the facility deposit, the forged deed, the fraudulent assessment, the medication pattern, the financial transfers. Pike asked 3 clarifying questions, each specific and professional. Then she said, "I'll need to see the binder. Can you come in on Monday?" Rosie said yes. She then called Sunrise Pines. She used a calm, measured tone and did not identify herself by name. She said she was confirming details for a December 19th intake. The coordinator on the line was cheerful and efficient, referencing June's file with the ease of someone who had been briefed and had no reason to suspect the person calling was anything other than a confirming family member. She mentioned June's aggressive dementia behaviors. She mentioned the secured unit placement that had been arranged for safety. She mentioned the specialized memory care protocol designed for patients at June's stage. Rosie wrote every word down as the coordinator spoke. When the call ended, she sat in the quiet car for a moment with the notepad in her lap. The fury she felt was not hot. It had passed through heat and come out the other side as something colder, cleaner, more sustainable. It was the kind of anger that does not waste itself on expression. It was the kind that gets things done. I had spent years swallowing insults so the room could stay calm, she thought. The sleet had begun to tick against the windshield, light and persistent, the particular sound of winter weather that has decided to commit. Not this time, because calm is what they used to bury us. The physician's evaluation came first, as scheduled. Daniel arrived early, wearing a camel overcoat and the specific confidence of a man watching his own plan execute. He stood in June's hallway and told Rosie she was too emotionally involved to be present during the assessment, that it would be better for June if the evaluation were conducted without her. He said it with the synthetic gentleness he deployed whenever he needed to move someone out of a room. Rosie wanted to stand in that doorway with every binder under her arm and refuse. She followed the plan instead. She stepped back. She went upstairs. She let June perform the particular calibrated uncertainty that 2 women who had discussed this exact scenario had agreed upon beforehand, enough uncertainty to seem plausible, not enough to be pathological. Exactly the performance of an old woman who was vaguely confused by having a stranger in her home but fundamentally coherent, the way any 79-year-old might reasonably behave. She let Daniel believe that performance was his victory. 2 days later, Lauren Pike arrived at the front door of the house on Maple Ridge. She came with a county social worker. She came without advance notice to Daniel, which had been arranged through Carter specifically to prevent him from preparing June or the physical environment. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table that had been cleared of its war room contents and returned, temporarily, to the appearance of an ordinary home and administered the standard cognitive assessment. While Rosie sat in the corner chair with her hands in her lap. June named the current president. She named the month, the year, the address at which she had lived for 31 years, and her own date of birth without hesitation. She described her daily routine, her preferences, her intentions regarding her living situation and her finances. She stated clearly that she wished to remain at home. She stated clearly that she had not authorized any facility placement. She was alert, articulate, and completely, undeniably herself. Rosie handed Pike the binder. The investigator read for over an hour. The room was quiet except for the turn of pages and the furnace cycling and the occasional sound of June's teacup being set back in its saucer. Rosie watched Pike's face and saw recognition moving through it, recognition of what she was looking at, of what it represented, of what had been done and documented and brought to this table. In a spiral notebook and 2 binders and a fireproof box. Pike looked up at last. This may be the most comprehensive family caregiver documentation I've ever seen. The room settled around the sentence. Rosie felt the anger shift beneath her ribs, not gone, not diminished, but reorganized. Refined from fury into something more precise. More actionable. Something that could be aimed. For the first time in 14 months, the paperwork was working for them. Daniel chose December 18th for his celebration dinner. The choice was not accidental. He had the physician's assessment completed. He had the intake confirmation from Sunrise. He had the December 19th admission date in writing. In his accounting, the story was essentially finished: one more family gathering, a formal announcement, an orderly exit, and then the airport. 2 days to Hawaii. He arrived at June's house that evening with the particular energy of a man who has spent months working towards something. And can finally see it from the other side. The same people came. The same dining room filled with the same bodies. There was lasagna again. Megan had brought it this time, from a restaurant downtown, in an aluminum takeout pan still warm from the delivery bag. Cheap red wine opened on the counter. The children ran through the downstairs while adults settled themselves around the table and the chandelier lit the whole room amber. Suitcases sat in the front hallway near the bench by the door, already packed, tagged, ready for an early morning car to the airport in 48 hours. Daniel stood with one hand resting on the back of his chair, the other holding a wine glass that he raised when the conversation reached a natural pause. "Good news," he said. The room settled the way rooms do when someone who has taken charge of a situation announces the outcome they have arranged. Faces turned toward him. The children were hushed. Forks were lowered. "Dr. Mercer confirmed what we've all been worried about. Mom needs professional memory care, and Sunrise is fully prepared for intake tomorrow morning." His smile held the warmth of a man who has mistaken efficiency for love. "We can leave for Hawaii knowing she's safe, knowing she's being cared for properly, knowing we made the right decision as a family." He raised his glass. Rosie stood before she realized she had moved. The chair scraped against the floor, the same hard, involuntary sound it had made at the last family dinner, weeks ago, but this time something about her posture was different. Her hands were steady. The red binder was already in them, and she had carried it to the table so naturally that no one had thought to wonder why. "Actually," she said, "there was another evaluation." Daniel's smile did not disappear immediately. It went through a transition, a moment of reinterpretation, a reassessment of what she might mean by that. A testing of whether the words could be neutralized the way her words had always been neutralized before. And then something moved behind his eyes that she had never seen there, because she had never given him reason to see it. Uncertainty. Linda went pale before the rest of the room fully understood. She had been watching Rosie and had seen what was in her hands. Rosie placed the APS report on the table. The pages landed with a flat, clean sound against the wood. Official letterhead. Lauren Pike's signature at the bottom of the cover page. Date December 16, 2025. June scored within normal range for her age on every cognitive measure administered, Rosie said. Her voice was level, not raised, not triumphant, but carrying the particular authority of someone reciting documented fact. In a room full of people who will have to account for their response to it. She does not meet criteria for memory care placement. She has expressed clearly and on the record her wish to remain at home. APS has opened a formal investigation into financial exploitation and fraudulent institutionalization of a vulnerable adult. Every face in the room changed at a different speed. Daniel lunged forward, one hand reaching for the report. June's voice stopped him. She had not stood yet. She rose now slowly, with one hand steady on the table. Edge in her posture as deliberate as it had been at every family dinner when she was watching and they were performing. The pearl earrings caught the chandelier light. She looked at her son with the expression of a woman who has been patient for a specific reason and has now reached the end of her patience's purpose. "Sit down, Daniel." The two words moved through the room like something structural. He sat. June opened the fireproof box that Rosie had carried to the table while setting up and placed the voice recorder in the center. She did not press play yet. She looked around the table, first at Ethan, at Megan, at Linda, at the two cousins who had been present at the first dinner and were present now, at the children who had gone still in the kitchen doorway. "You're going to hear something," she said. "And then you're going to see something. And then I'd like everyone to consider very carefully what it means that one person in this family saw all of it coming and wrote it down. And what it means that none of the rest of you did." Rosie connected her laptop to the television in the den, visible through the open double doors from the dining room. June pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the room from the small recorder, flat, deliberate, unmistakable. "If you won't cooperate, I'll have you declared incompetent. You understand what that means. I'll have it done before spring." The recording was clear. The silence after it was total. Then the television screen came to life. Rosie had organized the presentation in the same way she organized her binders, sequentially, by category, each item labeled with its source and date. The Hawaiian airfare appeared on the screen, pulled from the Care Fund account, coded in the banking system as medical transport patient. Beside it, the hotel reservation confirmation from the resort in Maui, coded as therapeutic lodging supervised. Below those excursion charges, a sunset catamaran, a helicopter tour of the Nepali coast, a beachside luau, each one listed under wellness activity therapeutic. The charges totaled more than the caregiving reimbursement listed in the folder upstairs, and the caregiver it reimbursed had never been paid $1. The forged deed comparison came next. June's authentic signature from 6 different historical documents arranged on the left. The Elm Street deed signature on the right, enlarged. The terminal H. The direction of the final stroke. The pen pressure. The difference was visible to anyone in the room who looked directly at it. Then the trazodone log. The dates of pickup. The cross-reference with Sunday visit dates. The sleep monitor data, pulled from the app on Rosie's phone, showing normal rest on every night of the documented period. Except those following Daniel's afternoon visits, long, flat lines of sedation appearing in the data like bruises. Then the email chain. It appeared last because Rosie had planned it that way. The family group chat, screenshotted from the thread she had been included in without anyone thinking carefully about the implication. The message from Ethan to Megan, sent 6 weeks ago: "Does R suspect anything yet?" Megan's reply: "Not that I can tell. She's still just doing the care stuff." Ethan again: "Good. Keep it that way." Megan made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound of a person encountering the record of themselves, the specific shock of seeing private calculation displayed on a screen in a room full of people, without the softening of context or interpretation. The television cast a pale blue light over stunned faces. This is what justice sounds like, Rosie thought. Not shouting. Facts spoken aloud where everyone can hear them. "You didn't leave me behind because I was family," she said to Daniel. Her voice was even. "You left me behind because I was the witness. And you needed me in the house. And you needed me not to understand what I was looking at." She paused. "I was just slow." Uncle Mark, who had sat through 3 family gatherings in near silence, said it so quietly it was barely audible: "Jesus." Megan was crying, the specific, involuntary crying that comes not from grief, but from shame, from the collision of the person she believed herself to be with the record of what she had actually done. Ethan's jaw was locked, his eyes on the floor, his hands flat on the table in the posture of a man who has run out of places to be. Linda said, "We can fix this." June cut through the sentence without raising her voice. "No, you can return what was stolen. That is not the same as fixing it." Lauren Pike arrived 23 minutes later. She came with a county deputy, which Carter had recommended not for drama, but for documentation, for the presence of official witness in the moment when the formal investigation became publicly known to the subject. The deputy requested Daniel step outside. His voice was professionally neutral. The request was not. Daniel stood slowly. His camel overcoat was on the coat rack by the door. He did not reach for it. He walked toward the front of the house with the measured step of a man conserving whatever dignity he could manage under the circumstances, and the sound of the front door opening and closing behind him and the deputy's voice beginning outside was, to Rosie, the most important sound she had heard in months. The room released a breath it had been holding for years. 9 people left before dessert. A cousin, the younger one, who had brought her children and sat at the corner of the table, stopped in the doorway on her way out and apologized. The apology was genuine and inadequate, and June received it with a nod and nothing more. Ethan left without speaking to anyone, his keys already in his hand. Megan collected her children from the kitchen and moved through the room with her eyes down, not from rudeness, but from the specific orientation of someone who cannot yet bear to see the face of the person they harmed. Linda remained at the table after everyone else had gone. She sat in the quiet of the emptied room for a long time, her wine glass untouched, her hands in her lap. Then, in a gesture so private that Rosie almost looked away, she reached up and removed her wedding ring. She set it on the table beside the glass. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at Rosie with an expression that was not apology and not defiance, but something more exhausted than either, the expression of a woman who has spent decades as a particular kind of accomplice and has finally become too tired to sustain it. She left without speaking. Rosie stood in the empty dining room and listened to the house resettle around the departure of all those bodies. The chandelier hummed. The printer light on the sideboard blinked green. The television screen had gone dark. In the kitchen, June was filling the electric kettle, the small, familiar sound of water and then the click of the heating element beginning its work. Daniel called the next morning. He was defeated in the way of a man who has had his options explained to him by an attorney and understands the landscape. He spoke without the usual architecture of charm, no smile in his voice, no warmth being manufactured. He agreed to full restitution to the care fund. He agreed to cancel the facility admission, contact Sunrise directly, and acknowledge to them in writing that the placement had been arranged under false pretenses. He agreed to withdraw from all financial accounts pending the formal investigation. He agreed to voluntary supervised contact only, pending further review. Rosie listened without speaking until he had finished. She said, "I'll have Carter's office send the paperwork today." She ended the call. She set the phone face down on the kitchen counter. She stood for a moment in the morning light coming through the window, the particular winter light of Asheville in December, thin and clear, making the oak tree outside look skeletal and clean against a pale sky. The truth had not made her triumphant. It had made her free. January came slowly. It arrived the way things arrive after a rupture, not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, but with the patient accumulation of ordinary mornings that were no longer shaped by dread. The house on Maple Ridge was quieter now, and the quiet was different in quality than the silence that had preceded the dinner. That silence had been full of things being hidden, things being managed, things being said in other houses about this one. This silence was empty in the useful way. A room cleared of furniture to let in light. The legal folders on the kitchen counter were new ones, properly labeled in James Carter's administrative assistant's careful type. A power of attorney, redrawn and signed before a notary in Carter's office, with Rosie as the designated agent formally, on paper, in a document that would withstand challenge. A paid caregiver agreement drafted to meet North Carolina's eldercare standards, countersigned by June and witnessed by both Carter and the notary, specifying terms, hours, and compensation retroactive to the beginning of the year. June had insisted on the retroactive clause. "You've been working," she said, when Rosie hesitated over the date. "That work happened. It should be paid." Rosie set the pen down for a moment and looked at the agreement at her own name. Printed in the party of the first part section, at the hourly rate that was fair and documented and defensible and nothing like the $18,000 phantom reimbursement that had once appeared in a bottom drawer. She thought about the hardship withdrawal form she had opened and closed in September. She signed on the line. Respect, she found, did have a paperwork version. It looked like this. APS completed its findings in mid-January. The report ran to 22 pages. Lauren Pike had been thorough in the way that professionals are thorough when the documentation they've been given makes thoroughness possible, following each category of evidence to its conclusion. Corroborating Rosie's records against external sources, requesting the pharmacy's dispensing history directly, subpoenaing the bank records, obtaining a handwriting analysis of the Elm Street deed signature from a certified document examiner. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult confirmed. Improper medication administration confirmed. Fraudulent representation to a licensed care facility documented and referred. Forgery of a real estate instrument referred to the county district attorney for consideration. Daniel accepted the plea arrangement through his attorney without going to trial. The terms were specific: full restitution of all misappropriated funds to June's care account, payable within 90 days. 3 years probation. Supervised contact with June only, subject to prior approval. Permanent removal from any fiduciary role in June's finances or estate. Mandatory completion of an elder abuse prevention program as a condition of probation. The Elm Street deed forgery was addressed separately in the civil agreement. The deed transfer was voided, the property restored to June's name, the holding company dissolved. Dr. Paul Mercer received a formal letter of censure from the North Carolina Medical Board and a temporary restriction from conducting competency evaluations pending a review of his recent assessment history. The restriction was later extended into a permanent condition on his practice license. Sunrise Pines was notified in writing that the intake had been based on fraudulent medical representations. They acknowledged receipt and closed the file. The family divided exactly where the truth had always divided it. Ethan cut contact. He sent a single text to Rosie's phone: "I need space," and did not follow up. She did not follow up either. The space he needed was apparently extensive, because it persisted through February and into spring and showed no signs of narrowing. Several cousins disappeared from June's orbit the way relatives sometimes do when the cost of association rises above what they are willing to pay. Holiday cards stopped arriving. Text threads went quiet. Rosie noted the absences the way she noted most things now, factually, without excessive interpretation. Linda filed for divorce in January, citing irreconcilable differences in the language that divorces use, when the actual reason would require too much explanation. She moved into the spare bedroom of a woman from her church choir, who was widowed and had the room and the willingness. She called June once a week, brief calls that were awkward at the start and gradually less so, conversations that were not reconciliation exactly, but were the cautious preliminary movements of a woman trying to determine whether reconciliation might eventually be possible. June took the calls. She did not hurry toward warmth. Megan arrived in February with a pie from the Harris Teeter Bakery, the same one where Daniel used to buy muffins for his Sunday performances. She stood at the door with the pie box and the specific demeanor of someone who has prepared extensively for an encounter. They know they do not deserve to navigate comfortably. She said she was sorry. She said it plainly, without the qualifiers that people attach to apologies, when they are hedging against the possibility of being asked to carry the full weight of what they did. Rosie held the door open. "Come in," she said. She did not forgive on a schedule. She did not refuse to try. She held both things. Rosie returned to 32 hours per week at the assisted living facility. She updated her resume for the first time in 3 years, noting her documentation experience with clinical caregiving. She paid off the credit card balances in the order of their interest rates, starting with the one she had opened to cover groceries in October. She paid the car insurance. She stopped apologizing when she said no to overtime shifts that didn't suit her schedule. The blue notebook remained in the kitchen drawer, because some habits outlast their original purpose and become simply part of who a person is. But the entries had changed. She wrote things down differently now. Soup made, tomato and white bean. June ate 2 bowls. Blood pressure 121/75. Good. Watched a nature documentary about seabirds. June laughed at the pelicans. Neighbor Marion stopped by with a sweet potato casserole. Discussed church gossip for 45 minutes. Very satisfying. One bright Saturday in February, June came into the kitchen carrying a road atlas. She set it on the table and opened it to North Carolina, running one finger east from the mountains across the Piedmont, across the sandhills, out to the coast. She set her finger on the coastline and looked at Rosie. Do you still want to see the ocean? Rosie looked at her pale green cardigan and her pearl earrings and the expression on her face. Which was the expression of a woman who has gotten through something extremely difficult and has arrived on the other side still herself, and intends to spend the remaining portion of her life accordingly. Yes, Rosie said. 2 weeks later they drove east on I-40 in Rosie's Honda, which had passed its inspection with only a minor complaint about the front brake pads that had since been addressed. A cooler of sandwiches sat in the back seat, turkey and Swiss on sourdough, a bag of kettle chips, 2 mandarin oranges, and a thermos of coffee. June's cardigan was folded on the seat beside the cooler. Rosie had a small overnight bag. They had booked a room at a modest inn on Wrightsville Beach for 2 nights. Chosen because June could walk to the water from the parking lot without negotiating stairs. No one to ask permission from. No one to arrange things around. No one to leave them behind. The ocean appeared beyond the dunes without warning. Rosie had expected to see it gradually, the way things arrive when you're driving toward them as a line on the horizon, then as color, then as detail. Instead it simply appeared past the last row of beach houses, beyond the sea oats moving in the February wind. A sweep of cold blue-gray water under a pale winter sky, enormous and indifferent and completely, startlingly real. The wind hit her face when she opened the car door. It smelled of salt and cold and something else she had no word for, something that belonged to open water and distance. And the specific quality of air that has traveled a long way to reach you. She walked down the sandy path between the dunes without stopping, without deciding to, because her feet already knew. A wave rolled in over the flat sand and broke cold and white around her shoes, soaking the cuffs of her jeans. She stopped. She stood there with the water retreating around her feet and pulling the sand out gently from beneath her soles, and the next wave came and did it again. And she felt something in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite relief but partook of both the feeling of arriving somewhere you were told was not for you, and finding that the ocean does not check the guest list. She cried. Not collapsing crying, not the crying of someone losing something, the crying of someone who has been walking a long way and has finally arrived at the place they were always walking toward, and whose body marks the arrival before the mind fully catches up. She stood in the cold February surf on a beach in North Carolina and cried in the uncomplicated way of a person who has earned it. June took her hand. She had come down the path behind her, coat buttoned wrong in the way of a person dressed in a hurry. Smiling into the wind with a directness that the sea air seemed to suit. Her grip was the same papery, fierce, more certain than it looked. This is what family does, she said. We show up for each other's firsts. Rosie laughed through the tears, the sound taken immediately by the wind and carried off over the water. Gulls called somewhere above them, and the surf moved in and out with the patience of something that had been doing this for a very long time and did not intend to stop. And the sky went all the way to the edge of what she could see. Later that spring, Lauren Pike called on a Tuesday afternoon. She asked whether Rosie would be willing to speak at a county caregiver training workshop about documentation systems in elder care, how to build them, how to maintain them, what to include, how to present them to investigators and attorneys in ways that were clear and usable. She said there were family caregivers in the county who had no idea that the notes they kept every day could be evidence. She said the APS department had been looking for someone who knew the system from the inside. Rosie brought her templates. She brought the binder structure with its color-coded tabs and its cross-reference spreadsheet and its signature comparison methodology. She made copies of her tracking sheets, the medication log, the visit log, the sleep monitor data export format. the financial discrepancy worksheet and set them on the folding tables in the county meeting room where 12 family caregivers sat in metal chairs with notebooks open and listened to a 34-year-old CNA from Asheville explain what she had written down and why, and what it had cost her, and what it had eventually been worth. By spring, hundreds of caregivers had downloaded the templates from the county APS website. Lauren Pike sent Rosie an email in April. You should know we've already used your documentation model in 2 separate investigations this quarter. The private survival method had become a public tool. I thought losing half my family would feel like a wound forever. The tide moved around her ankles in the February cold, and June's hand was warm in hers. Maybe it's not loss, Rosie thought, looking out at the horizon where the water met the sky at the clean, certain line of something very large. Maybe it's room. She had not gotten the life she should have had. She had spent years being useful in the particular way that renders a person invisible. Had been left behind by people who required her presence and dismissed her simultaneously. Had compressed herself into the shape available to her in a family that had decided, without discussion, what shape she should be. What she had gotten instead was harder and more honest, and she had found, in the getting of it, that she was someone who could survive the difference. At 34, Rosie Hale finally understood that starting over was not abandonment. It was not resignation. It was not the story of someone who had failed to hold the life she had. It was authorship. Back in Asheville, the photograph from the beach sat in a frame beside June's recipe box on the kitchen counter. Rosie had printed it herself on the photo paper from the office supply store. With the steady hands of a woman who no longer needed to grip anything to keep herself upright. In the photograph, June looked dignified and mischievous, with the wind in her white hair and the ocean behind her. And Rosie stood beside her looking out at the camera with the expression of a person who has been let back into her own life and intends to stay. For the first time, the future felt like something she could sign her name to. Friends, how did you find today's story? Rosie Hale spent years making herself small so the people around her could feel large. She crushed the pills. She kept the logs. She cooked the meals and stayed behind and told herself that usefulness was the same thing as belonging. And for a long time, a longer time than any of us would want for someone we care about, she believed that. But here is what this story tells us. It tells us that paying attention is not the same as passivity. That writing things down is not the same as resignation. That a woman who has been overlooked for 34 years can, when the moment arrives, produce 2 binders, a spreadsheet, a forged signature comparison, and a voice recording that brings a man's carefully constructed scheme down in a single dinner. It tells us that the people we overlook are often the people who see everything. And it tells us something else, something about June, who was nearly 79 years old. And had already started keeping her own records before anyone else in that house understood what was happening. There is a particular kind of wisdom that belongs to people who have lived long enough to know exactly what a rushed signature request means. To know the difference between a son performing concern and a son calculating risk. June knew. She kept the evidence and waited for a witness. These 2 women found each other in the middle of the hardest thing either of them had faced, and they chose to face it together, not dramatically. Not with weapons or confrontation or the satisfaction of having someone finally believe them before the damage was done. They chose it the way most real courage is chosen, quietly, in an ordinary kitchen, in the middle of the night. With a laptop and a plastic binder and a very long piece of paper. If you have someone in your life who is aging and vulnerable, pay attention to the people who show up every day and keep the records. They are not the background of that story. They are often the only reason the story ends well. I hope this story brought you something meaningful today. Something to carry with you about patience, about witness, about the particular courage of a woman who learns, at 34, that the life she deserved had been waiting for her at the ocean all along. Please subscribe and hit that like button, and we'll see you in the next story.